A 10-year-old black girl excited to fly in first class for the first time. Ready to visit her father waiting at the other end of the journey. But when she steps onto the plane, everything changes. A flight attendant targets her without reason, humiliates her in front of the entire cabin, and forces her to leave her seat. Just 7 minutes later, she's in economy, holding back tears and clutching her journal. What happened next shocked everyone and sparked a movement that no one could have predicted. Stay with me, this is a story you need to hear. Before we start, let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that matter. The hum of the plane's engines was soft, steady, almost a lullaby. Amara Ellison, just 10 years old, sat in her first-class seat, her legs swinging slightly beneath the polished wooden table. Her father, Elijah, had packed her bag with care, her favorite journal, a set of colorful pens, and her trusty stuffed bear tucked snugly inside. This wasn't her first time flying alone, but it was her first time flying first class, and her young mind brimmed with curiosity about the experience. The cabin was serene, a cocoon of luxury and calm. Passengers settled into their leather seats, their murmured conversations blending with the rhythmic clink of glasses as the flight attendants served pre-flight drinks. Amara's excitement was evident in the way her fingers traced the edges of the menu before her. She wasn't old enough to appreciate champagne or lobster bisque, but the idea of being treated like a grown-up made her sit a little taller, her small frame radiating a quiet pride. At the far end of the cabin, Sarah Caldwell observed the scene with practiced detachment. The senior flight attendant had seen it all in her years of service: powerful businessmen, wealthy couples, celebrities, but a child, alone in first class, sparked something in her she couldn't quite name. She glanced down at the manifest, her brow furrowing when she saw the name Amara Ellison. There was nothing out of place, nothing to question, yet Sarah felt a prick of unease. Perhaps it was the pressure of Ethan Remington's recent call, his smooth voice reminding her of the favor she owed him. Or perhaps it was the quiet hum of bias she had never thought to question. Does a child like that really belong here? The thought came unbidden, shameful in its simplicity, but there it was, undeniable. As Sarah prepared to approach Amara, she adjusted her navy blazer, her clipboard tucked tightly under her arm like a shield. Each step toward the young girl seemed to echo louder, cutting through the calm of the cabin. The passengers nearest to Amara barely noticed her approach, but Amara did. Her wide, curious eyes met Sarah's with a blend of politeness and uncertainty. "Excuse me, miss," Sarah began, her tone even but cool. "May I see your boarding pass?" Amara blinked, surprised but compliant. "Sure," she said softly, reaching into her small shoulder bag. Her fingers brushed against the bear before pulling out the neatly folded paper. She handed it to Sarah, who unfolded it with deliberate care. The ticket was flawless: seat 2A. First class, printed boldly at the top. Sarah stared at it for a moment too long, her mind racing. The protocol was clear, but the pressure from Ethan rang louder in her ears. "Charles Abernathy needs a first-class seat. Make it happen." "I'm afraid there's been a mistake," Sarah said, her words clipped, her tone sharpening. "This seat has been reassigned." Amara tilted her head, her brow furrowing. "But my dad bought this seat for me. It says so right there." Sarah's fingers tightened on the clipboard. "I understand," she said, her voice laced with a firmness she hoped would end the conversation. "But sometimes these things happen. I'll need you to move to another seat in economy." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, the hum of the engines seemed louder, more oppressive. Amara's small hands gripped the armrests, her knuckles turning white as she processed what was happening. "But why?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with the confusion of a child being told something that didn't make sense. "I didn't do anything wrong," Sarah faltered, the weight of the exchange pressing down on her. Around them, passengers began to notice. Whispers floated through the cabin, subtle but growing. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, her tone harder now, as if to mask her discomfort. "The decision has been made. Please gather your belongings." Amara sat still, her small frame rigid, her breath coming in shallow bursts. Finally, with trembling hands, she reached for her bag, her movements deliberate but slow. A flight attendant nearby, Vanessa, started forward, her expression one of quiet protest. But Sarah shot her a look that froze her in place. The walk to the economy cabin felt endless. Amara held her bag tightly against her chest. Her head high, though her cheeks burned with humiliation. She passed rows of curious passengers, their eyes darting away when she glanced toward them. The whispers grew louder, fragments of words reaching her ears. Child. Economy. Mistake, each one a tiny cut she couldn't defend against. By the time she reached her new seat, Amara's hands were shaking. She placed her bag beneath the seat in front of her and sat down. Staring straight ahead, the world around her buzzed, the flight attendants preparing for takeoff. The passengers shifting in their seats, but Amara felt as though she had been placed in a bubble. Separate and unseen. In first class, Sarah returned to her duties. Her face set in a mask of professionalism. Yet, deep in her chest, a knot tightened, a discomfort she refused to name. Across the aisle, a passenger leaned toward his companion and whispered, "Did you see that? She's just a kid." Sarah heard him but didn't turn. Her clipboard felt heavier in her hands, and her throat burned with something she couldn't swallow down. She told herself it was nothing, a simple misunderstanding. But as the plane took off, her reflection in the cabin window seemed to disagree. In her seat, Amara opened her journal. Her pencil moved slowly at first, then faster, as she poured her feelings onto the page. She didn't cry, she refused to, but the words blurred as she wrote them. Her young heart aching with a confusion she didn't yet have the tools to name. The world outside the plane was endless, the horizon stretching far beyond what she could see. But inside, it felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls were closing in. And somewhere in the silence of her heart, Amara made a quiet vow: this isn't over. The quiet of the economy cabin wrapped itself around Amara like an unwelcome blanket. The rows were narrower here, the chatter of passengers louder, less restrained. Amara sat rigid in her seat, her hands clutching the edges of her journal as if it were the only thing tethering her to a sense of control. The hum of the engine seemed different back here, heavier somehow, vibrating in a way that matched the ache in her chest. She opened her journal again, her small fingers flipping through its pages. Her sketches and stories stared back at her, remnants of a world that felt far away. She thought of her father's reassuring words that morning: "You're brave, my little explorer. You belong wherever you set foot." But here, now, the feeling of belonging was distant, unreachable. Nearby, a flight attendant, Vanessa, watched her quietly. She had seen everything, from the stiffness in Sarah's posture to the tremble in Amara's hands as she walked down the aisle. Vanessa felt the injustice keenly. But the hierarchy aboard the plane silenced her. Sarah had been clear this wasn't a matter for discussion. Yet, the look on Amara's face, a mixture of hurt and determination far beyond her years, lingered with Vanessa like an ache she couldn't ignore. Amara's concentration broke when a soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me, miss." It was Vanessa, crouched beside her seat. In her hands were a fresh napkin and a small glass of water. "I thought you might need this." Amara blinked, surprised. She hesitated before taking the water, her fingers brushing against Vanessa's in the exchange. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Vanessa smiled, a kind, apologetic tilt to her lips. "If you need anything, just press the call button. Okay?" Amara nodded, her grip on the water tightening as Vanessa disappeared back into the aisle. For a moment, the gesture soothed her, but it was fleeting. The whispers around her persisted, soft but sharp, like needles in the fabric of her resilience. In the first-class cabin, Sarah moved efficiently, her clipboard a shield between herself and the whispers she now couldn't ignore. "Did you see what she did to that little girl?" a woman whispered to her seatmate. Sarah's jaw clenched. She told herself she had done what was necessary, what Ethan had asked of her. But the weight of her actions clung to her like a second skin. The passenger's disapproval was a quiet storm brewing at the edges of her composure. Ethan's voice echoed in her memory. "Handle it discreetly. We don't need any disruptions." She had handled it, hadn't she? Yet, she couldn't shake the image of Amara's wide eyes. Her soft but firm protest. "My dad paid for this seat." The words lingered, unsettling and sharp. Meanwhile, in the economy cabin, the turbulence began, both literal and figurative. The plane shook lightly, causing the plastic cup of water on Amara's tray to topple over. The cold liquid spread across the surface, soaking her open journal. Amara gasped, her hands darting to save what she could. But the damage was done. Her journal, her safe space, was now smeared and damp, the ink of her words bleeding into one another. Her heart pounded as she frantically pressed napkins against the pages, trying to salvage the sketches and entries that held so much of her world. Vanessa reappeared in moments, kneeling beside her with a fresh stack of napkins. "I'm so sorry," Vanessa said, her voice gentle but firm. "Let me help." Amara shook her head, her lips pressed tightly together as she fought back tears. "It's ruined," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It's not," Vanessa assured her, but her own heart ached at the sight of Amara's trembling hands. "We'll fix it." As Vanessa worked to clean the mess, Sarah walked through the economy aisle, clipboard in hand, her eyes scanning the rows. When she saw Vanessa crouched beside Amara, her steps slowed. "Vanessa," Sarah said, her voice low but firm. "A word, please." Vanessa rose, her expression guarded. "Of course." Sarah led her to the galley, away from the passenger's view. "What do you think you're doing?" Sarah demanded, her tone sharp. "You're here to serve, not to interfere." "I was helping," Vanessa said evenly. "She's a child, Sarah. She needed someone to show her a little kindness." Sarah's jaw tightened. Kindness doesn't change policy, and it doesn't undo decisions that are already made. "No, but it might make someone feel seen." Vanessa shot back, her voice steady but laced with quiet defiance. "That little girl didn't deserve what happened to her." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Watch your tone, Vanessa. You're already walking a fine line." Vanessa stared at her, the weight of her unspoken thoughts heavy in the air. But she nodded, stepping back into the aisle without another word. As the flight neared its destination, Amara sat quietly, her head resting against the cold window. The city lights below shimmered like a promise of safety. But her heart felt heavy. She thought of her father waiting at the gate, his warm smile and strong embrace. But how would she explain what had happened? When the plane finally touched down, the tension in the air was palpable. Sarah stood at the front of the cabin, her posture rigid, her professional mask firmly in place. Amara exited the plane with quiet dignity, her small figure disappearing into the crowd. Vanessa watched her go, her chest tight with regret. And Sarah avoided Amara's gaze entirely, the knot of discomfort in her chest tightening further. In the terminal, Elijah spotted Amara instantly. His face lit up as he called her name. But when she ran into his arms, he felt the stiffness in her embrace, the slight tremble in her small frame. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" he asked, pulling back to look at her. Amara hesitated, her eyes glistening. "Nothing," she said softly, but the lie sat heavy between them. As Elijah guided her toward the baggage claim, his sharp eyes caught the subtle shift in her posture, the way she clutched her journal tightly to her chest. He didn't press her, he knew better than to force her words. But in his heart, he knew something had happened, and he would find out what. The chapter ends with Elijah's silent resolve growing stronger, a storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. Amara, though small, holds the weight of an experience that should never have been hers to carry. And Sarah, standing at the gate, watches them leave with a gnawing sense that the choices she made will not go unanswered. Elijah Ellison sat across from Amara in the living room, the warm glow of a table lamp casting soft shadows on the walls. Amara's journal lay on the coffee table between them, closed but radiating an unspoken weight. She had clutched it tightly since they arrived home, her knuckles white against the soft leather. Elijah's heart ached as he watched her small hands tremble. Whatever had happened on that flight had left a mark, deeper than she was ready to explain. "Sweetheart," he began gently, his voice steady, "you know you can tell me anything, right?" Amara nodded, her eyes fixed on the journal. "I know, Daddy," she whispered, but her voice was distant, her thoughts far away. Elijah waited, giving her the space to speak, but the silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Finally, Amara pushed the journal toward him, her fingers lingering on the cover for a moment before letting go. Maybe you should just read it," she said softly, her voice breaking on the last word. Elijah picked up the journal carefully, his large hands almost engulfing it. He opened it to the most recent entry. The ink smudged in places from where water or tears had blurred the words. As he read, his jaw tightened. Her handwriting, usually steady and deliberate, was shaky, the letters pressed deep into the paper as if she had written them through sheer force of will. "Something happened today on the plane. It wasn't fair, and it didn't feel right. She made me leave my seat, even though it was mine. She didn't say why, but I could feel it the way she looked at me. The way her voice sounded. Like I didn't belong there. Like I wasn't enough. It hurt. Daddy. It hurt so much. Elijah's chest burned as he read her words. He flipped the page to find a sketch of a woman in a flight attendant's uniform. The face was stern, the lines of her expression sharp and unkind. Below the drawing, Amara had written one question. Why did she see me this way? Elijah closed the journal, his breath slow and deliberate as he fought to keep his emotions in check. He reached out and took Amara's hand in his grip firm but gentle. This wasn't your fault, he said, his voice low but resolute. You hear me? None of this was your fault. Amara looked up at him, her wide eyes shimmering with unshed tears. But why did she do it? Daddy? Why did she make me feel like I didn't belong? Elijah's heart broke at her question. But he didn't have an answer. Not yet. What he did have was a growing determination to ensure his daughter never felt this way again. The next morning, Elijah sat in his study, his laptop open before him. The room was quiet, save for the soft clicks of the keyboard as he typed. He was combing through the airline's website, searching for contact information, policies, anything that might give him insight into the company's operations. His search quickly uncovered something troubling: numerous customer complaints buried deep within the site. Most were written off with generic responses. But a pattern was clear. Customers of color were disproportionately reporting incidents of mistreatment, both subtle and overt. Elijah's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Evelyn, Amara's mother. They had spoken briefly the night before, but now her voice carried a sharp edge of urgency. Elijah, she said, skipping pleasantries, I just got a message from Vanessa, one of the flight attendants on Amara's flight. She wants to talk. What did she say? Elijah asked, his tone measured. She didn't go into detail, but she said there's more to the story. She's willing to meet with us. Elijah leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. If a flight attendant was reaching out, it meant there was more beneath the surface, more than just one woman's actions. Set it up, he said firmly. I'll be there. Later that afternoon, Elijah and Evelyn met Vanessa in a quiet cafe near the airport. Vanessa looked nervous, her hands clasped tightly around a steaming cup of tea. Her uniform was gone, replaced by a simple sweater and jeans. But she carried herself with the same quiet grace that had drawn Amara's attention on the flight. Thank you for meeting with us, Elijah said, his voice warm but direct. We appreciate you taking the time. Vanessa nodded, her gaze flicking between the two of them. I couldn't stay silent, she said, her voice trembling slightly. What happened to your daughter wasn't right. Elijah leaned forward, his hands folded on the table. Tell us everything. Vanessa took a deep breath before she began. It started before the flight even took off. Sarah, the senior attendant, was already tense. She got a call from one of the shareholders, Ethan Remington, about reserving a first-class seat for someone important. When she saw Amara's name on the manifest, something shifted. She didn't say anything outright, but it was the way she looked at the name, the way she hesitated. It was like she'd already made up her mind. Evelyn's hands clenched into fists on the table. And no one said anything? Vanessa shook her head, her expression pained. I wanted to, but Sarah made it clear this wasn't up for discussion. She's senior staff, and I'm not. Elijah's voice was calm, but there was steel beneath his words. So, she acted on an assumption. She saw my daughter's name, her face, and decided she didn't belong. Vanessa nodded, her eyes filled with regret. It wasn't fair, and I'm sorry I didn't do more. Elijah's jaw tightened. You're doing something now. That matters. By evening, the anger simmering beneath Elijah's calm exterior was a full-blown storm. He sat at his desk, drafting an email to the airline's executive team. His words were measured but piercing, weaving Amara's experience with the broader issues of bias and accountability. This isn't just about one flight or one mistake. It's about a culture that allows assumptions to dictate actions, that permits bias to masquerade as protocol. My daughter deserved better. Every passenger deserves better. As he hit send, Elijah felt the weight of his resolve settle into place. This was just the beginning. What had happened to Amara was a spark, and he intended to fan it into a flame that could not be ignored. The early morning sunlight filtered through the curtains of Elijah Ellison's study, casting long shadows across his desk. His coffee sat untouched, growing colder by the minute as he pored over his laptop. Amara's journal rested on the corner of the desk, its weight heavier than the pages it contained. The raw pain of her words still lingered in his mind, a relentless echo that refused to fade. Elijah's email to the airline executives had been sent hours ago, but there was no response, just silence. The kind of silence he had learned to recognize over years of battling systemic indifference. It was the silence that protected those in power, shielding them from the consequences of their choices. Elijah's fingers hovered over the keyboard as he composed another message, this one sharper, more demanding. Before he could hit send, his phone buzzed. It was Evelyn. Her voice on the other end was calm but urgent. Elijah, I've been thinking, she said, this isn't just about Amara anymore. It's about every child who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong. We need to take this further. Elijah leaned back in his chair, her words aligning with the storm brewing in his own mind. I've started gathering evidence, complaints from other passengers, reports of similar incidents. There's a pattern. Evelyn, this isn't isolated. And if they ignore us, she asked, then we make sure they can't. By midday, Elijah and Evelyn sat in a conference room at a local community center. Joined by Vanessa, the young flight attendant had agreed to speak on record, her quiet bravery a stark contrast to the fear that had initially kept her silent. Vanessa laid a folder on the table, her hands trembling slightly. These are internal reports. I've kept copies of complaints from passengers. Incidents I've witnessed over the years. They always get brushed aside. They say it's protocol or a misunderstanding. But we know better. Evelyn scanned the documents, her brow furrowing. This is damning, she said, her voice laced with anger. They've built a system that hides the truth in plain sight. Elijah nodded, his jaw tight. We'll use this, but we need to make sure the story gets out loudly. Vanessa hesitated. There's one more thing, she said softly. Sarah, the senior flight attendant, she's not acting alone. Ethan Remington, one of the shareholders, has a reputation for pressuring staff to prioritize certain passengers. It's unspoken, but everyone knows. Evelyn exchanged a glance with Elijah. So, this goes even higher, she murmured. That evening, Elijah sat at his desk once more, crafting a statement for the press. His words were deliberate, each sentence a strike against the veil of complacency that had allowed such injustices to persist. My daughter's experience was not an anomaly. It is part of a broader pattern of bias that permeates not just this airline, but the systems we rely on every day. We will no longer remain silent. We demand accountability, transparency, and meaningful change, not just for Amara, but for everyone who has been made to feel invisible. He hit send, the weight of his words rippling out into the world. The story spread faster than Elijah could have anticipated. By morning, his inbox was flooded with messages, some supportive, others hostile. Social media exploded with hashtags like #LetAmaraSit and #FlyingWhileBlack. Strangers shared their own stories of bias and mistreatment, turning Amara's experience into a rallying cry. At the same time, the airline issued a tepid statement, calling the incident a misunderstanding and promising an internal review. It wasn't enough, and the public backlash only grew. Evelyn sat beside Elijah at the dining table, scrolling through the comments on one of the viral posts. People are paying attention, she said, her tone cautious but hopeful. This could be the turning point. Elijah nodded, though his expression remained grim. It's a start, but the airline's already trying to spin it. They're protecting themselves, not addressing the problem. His phone rang, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a reporter from a national news outlet, requesting an interview. Elijah agreed, his resolve hardening. If the airline wouldn't take responsibility, he would force their hand. The interview aired the following evening, a live segment that reached millions of viewers. Elijah sat under the bright studio lights, his demeanor calm but charged with purpose. The host, a seasoned journalist, began with the facts of the incident before diving into the deeper implications. This isn't just about one flight, Elijah said, his voice steady but impassioned. It's about the assumptions we make about who belongs where. It's about a culture that allows bias to dictate policy and behavior. My daughter had every right to sit in that seat, and she was made to feel like she didn't. That's not just wrong, it's dangerous. The host leaned forward, her expression earnest. What do you hope to achieve with this fight? Change, Elijah said simply. Not just for my daughter, but for everyone who has ever been pushed aside or silenced. This isn't just about Amara, it's about all of us. As the segment ended, Elijah's words echoed in households across the country. For some, they sparked uncomfortable reflection. For others, they reignited a long simmering anger. And for Amara, watching at home with Evelyn, they felt like a shield one she hadn't known she needed. "Daddy's so brave," she whispered, clutching her new journal tightly. Evelyn smiled, pulling her daughter close. "He's brave because of you. Sweetheart, you gave him a reason to fight." But not everyone was moved by Elijah's message. In the airline's corporate headquarters, Ethan Remington paced the length of a sleek conference room, his frustration boiling over. The executives sat in tense silence as Ethan slammed a folder onto the table. "This is getting out of hand," he snapped. "We need to control the narrative." One of the executives, a middle-aged woman with a sharp gaze, spoke cautiously. "The public isn't buying our statement. We need to do more." Ethan scowled. "We don't admit fault. We don't set a precedent for lawsuits. This will blow over." "It won't," she interrupted, her voice firm. "Ellison isn't backing down, and the media is with him. If we don't act, this could destroy us." Ethan glared at her, his jaw tightening. "Then we find a way to make him stop." Elijah Ellison stood at the window of his study, staring out at the city lights. His phone vibrated on the desk behind him, buzzing with notifications that came faster than he could keep up with. The interview had aired only hours ago, but the response was overwhelming. Supportive messages from strangers poured in, along with testimonials from others who had experienced similar injustices. Yet, mingled among them were the inevitable pushbacks, dismissals, accusations of overreaction, and calls for him to let it go. He turned from the window, his jaw tightening. Let it go? He couldn't. Not when the pain in Amara's eyes haunted him. Not when her small voice asking, "Why did she see me this way?" replayed in his mind like a broken record. No, there was no letting this go. There was only moving forward. The following morning, Elijah found himself back at the community center, joined by Evelyn, Vanessa, and a group of local activists who had offered their support. The air in the room was electric, a mix of determination and urgency as they reviewed the growing backlash against the airline. "We've got momentum," Evelyn said, her voice sharp with focus. "The media's paying attention, people are listening, but we need to keep the pressure on." Vanessa nodded. "I've been hearing from other employees, flight attendants, ground crew. They're scared, but some are willing to come forward. They've seen too much to stay silent." Elijah leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Then we build on that. We make it clear this isn't just about Amara. This is about every voice that's been silenced, every story that's been ignored." "But what happens when they push back harder?" one of the activists asked. "You know they will. They already are," Elijah replied, his tone grim. "That's why we can't afford to falter." Meanwhile, at the airline's corporate headquarters, Ethan Remington was losing his grip. The boardroom was tense, the once confident executives now whispering among themselves as the fallout from Elijah's campaign grew. "This is spiraling out of control," one of the board members said, her voice low but firm. "We need a real strategy, not just PR spin." Ethan slammed his palm against the table. "We don't admit fault," he growled. "If we do, we open ourselves up to lawsuits, to a media frenzy we can't contain." "But the frenzy is already here," another board member countered. "And if we don't act, it'll get worse." Ethan's face darkened. He hated being cornered, hated the idea of losing control. "Fine," he said finally, his voice cold. "We'll issue a stronger statement. But we don't name names. And we don't give them the satisfaction of an apology." The tension in the room was palpable as the executives reluctantly agreed. Ethan knew it wasn't enough. But he wasn't about to let a man like Elijah Ellison dictate his company's narrative. That evening, Elijah received an email from the airline's legal team. It was a thinly veiled threat, couched in polite corporate language. The gist was clear: stop the public campaign, or face the consequences. Evelyn read the email over his shoulder, her expression hardening. "They're trying to scare you," she said. "Don't let them." Elijah chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "They think this will make me back down. They don't understand what they started." He drafted a response, concise and resolute. "I will not be silenced. The public deserves the truth. And I intend to see that they get it." The next morning, Elijah's fight escalated in a way he hadn't anticipated. Amara's school had called, requesting a meeting. When Elijah and Evelyn arrived, the principal's expression was apologetic but firm. There have been concerns, the principal began, her hands clasped tightly on the desk. Some parents are uncomfortable with the media attention surrounding Amara's story. They feel it's creating a disruptive environment. Elijah's temper flared, but he kept his voice measured. A disruptive environment? My daughter spoke up about an injustice. That's not disruption, it's courage. The principal shifted uncomfortably. I'm not saying she's at fault, Mr. Ellison, but the other parents. Evelyn cut in, her tone icy. The other parents should be teaching their children about empathy, not fear. Amara is the victim here, not the problem. Despite their protests, the meeting ended with little resolution. As they left the office, Elijah glanced at Evelyn, his anger simmering just below the surface. This is bigger than the airline, he said. It's about everything, the unspoken rules, the quiet assumptions. People don't want to face it. Evelyn nodded, which is exactly why we have to keep going. As the day wore on, Elijah found himself at the center of a growing storm. News outlets reached out for follow-ups. Activists rallied around his cause. And the airline's lukewarm statement only fueled public outrage. But with the support came resistance, anonymous threats, social media vitriol, and whispers questioning his motives. That evening, Elijah sat with Amara in her room. She was quiet, her hands busy sketching in her journal. He watched her for a moment, his heart heavy with the weight of what this fight was costing her. Amara, he said softly, how are you feeling? She looked up, her eyes searching his. I'm okay, Daddy, just tired. Elijah nodded, his throat tight. I want you to know something, he said. What you did, telling the truth. Being brave, it matters. You're helping people, even if it doesn't feel like it right now. Amara gave him a small, tired smile. Do you really think it'll change anything? I do, Elijah said, his voice firm, because you've already changed me. And together, we can change so much more. The wind outside Elijah Ellison's home howled like a warning, rattling the windows in their frames. Inside, the air was thick with tension. The soft light of the living room lamp illuminated the small circle of people gathered around the coffee table. Elijah, Evelyn, Vanessa, and a young reporter named David Grant, whose voice had become a growing force in the national conversation about racial injustice. David sat forward in his chair, his notebook open, a pen poised in his hand. This is bigger than just one airline, he said, his voice calm but urgent. Your story has struck a nerve because it's something everyone recognizes, even if they don't want to admit it. The quiet ways people are told they don't belong, it's universal. Elijah nodded, his hands clasped tightly together. But it's not enough to recognize it, he said. People have to act. They have to see this for what it is and refuse to let it continue. Vanessa spoke up, her voice hesitant but firm. There are others willing to come forward, employees who've seen how this system operates. They're scared, but they're ready. David leaned closer, his pen moving swiftly across the page. If we can get their stories on record, it could shift the narrative completely. The public needs to see this isn't an isolated incident. Evelyn glanced at Elijah, her expression a mix of pride and worry. But the backlash will be intense, she said. You've already seen what they're willing to do to protect themselves. I know, Elijah replied, his voice steady. But we've come too far to stop now. The next day, Elijah received a call from the airline's legal team. The tone was sharper this time. The message clear. Withdraw the accusations, or face a lawsuit for defamation. Elijah listened calmly, his grip tightening on the phone. I'm not afraid of your threats, he said, his voice low and deliberate. If you want to take this to court, be my guest. But know this, you'll be fighting not just me, but every person you've tried to silence. He hung up before they could respond, his heart pounding. The stakes were higher now, and he knew the pressure would only increase. But he also knew he couldn't back down. That evening, Elijah's interview with David aired, reaching millions of viewers. The segment opened with a clip of Amara's story. Her words clear and haunting. She made me feel like I didn't belong. And I don't understand why. The camera cut to Elijah, his voice steady but filled with quiet fury. This isn't just about my daughter, he said. This is about a culture that allows people to make judgments based on appearances. It's about the countless stories that never get told because the people living them don't think anyone will listen. The response was immediate. Social media lit up with support. But the backlash was swift and brutal. Anonymous accounts flooded the platforms with vitriol, accusing Elijah of playing the victim, of stirring division. Amara's name was dragged into the fray, and Evelyn found herself deleting comments faster than she could read them. Elijah watched it all unfold with a mix of anger and resolve. "They're trying to drown us out," he said to Evelyn, "but we won't let them." As the days passed, the tension escalated. The airline launched a counter-campaign, painting themselves as victims of an unfair attack. They highlighted their diversity initiatives, showcasing smiling employees of various backgrounds in a glossy PR video. The message was clear: we're not the problem. Vanessa watched the video with a bitter laugh. "They're using us as props," she said. "It's disgusting." Elijah wasn't surprised. "This is what they do," he said. "They deflect, they distract, but the truth will cut through their noise." The breaking point came when one of the whistleblowers, a baggage handler named Marcus, was suspended after speaking out. The airline claimed it was for unrelated reasons, but the timing was too convenient to ignore. David broke the story, his article exposing the retaliation in stark detail. The public outrage reignited, and the calls for accountability grew louder. Protesters gathered outside the airline's headquarters, their signs declaring messages like, "Justice for Amara," and "Accountability now." Inside the headquarters, Ethan Remington was losing control. The boardroom was in chaos, the executives shouting over one another as the crisis deepened. "This is a PR nightmare," one of them yelled. "We need to do something, anything." Ethan's face was red with frustration. "We stick to the plan," he said through gritted teeth. "We deny, we deflect, and we ride this out." But the cracks in his authority were clear. Several board members exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence in his leadership waning. At home, Elijah and Evelyn watched the protests on the news. Amara sat between them, her small hand gripping her father's. "Daddy," she said softly, "are they really going to change things?" Elijah looked down at her, his heart aching with the weight of her question. "They will," he said firmly, "because we won't stop until they do." Amara nodded, her expression serious. "I want to help." "You already are," Evelyn said, wrapping an arm around her daughter. "You're the reason we're fighting." The night air was heavy, pressing down on the crowd gathered outside the airline's corporate headquarters. The rhythmic chants of protesters echoed through the city streets, their voices rising in unison. "Justice for Amara. Justice for all." The sound reverberated through the glass walls of the boardroom where Ethan Remington sat, his frustration simmering beneath his polished exterior. Inside the room, the tension was palpable. The executives were divided, their arguments growing louder as the protests outside intensified. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the picture of controlled fury, as he listened to their demands for a new strategy. "We need to issue a full apology," one board member said, her voice firm. "This isn't going away, Ethan. The longer we wait, the worse it gets." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Apologies are admissions of guilt," he snapped, "and guilt opens us up to lawsuits." Another executive, a younger man with an air of unease, shifted in his seat. "But what about the whistleblowers? If we don't address their claims, this could spiral even further." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "The whistleblowers are disgruntled employees looking for attention. We stay the course, this will blow over." But as he spoke, the protests outside grew louder, their chants cutting through the glass like a warning. At home, Elijah Ellison stood in front of the television, the glow of the news broadcast lighting up the room. Footage of the protests played on the screen, interspersed with interviews from supporters and detractors alike. Evelyn sat nearby, her hands folded tightly in her lap, while Amara rested her head against her father's side. "Daddy," Amara said softly, "do you think they'll listen?" Elijah placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression resolute. "They'll have to," he said, "because we're not giving them a choice." The reporter on the screen shifted to a segment about the airline's response or lack thereof. The company's refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing was fueling the fire, turning a single incident into a nationwide reckoning. Elijah's phone buzzed with notifications, each one a reminder of how far this fight had spread. But with the support came the threats. Anonymous emails and social media messages filled with venom and vitriol. Evelyn had started screening the calls to their home, her protective instincts on high alert. The weight of it all was heavy, but it was nothing compared to the determination that burned in Elijah's chest. "We're going to the protest tomorrow," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. All of us. Evelyn looked up, concern flickering in her eyes. Are you sure that's safe? It's necessary, Elijah replied. He turned to Amara, his voice softening. You don't have to go, sweetheart, but if you want to. I think it's important for people to see the face of what we're fighting for. Amara straightened, her young face filled with a quiet strength. I want to go, she said. I want to help. The next day, the protests reached a fever pitch. Elijah, Evelyn, and Amara arrived at the headquarters just as the crowd swelled to its largest yet. People of all ages and backgrounds held signs with messages like, "End the silence," and "Every passenger matters." Cameras flashed as reporters documented the scene, their microphones capturing the voices of those who had come to stand in solidarity. Elijah took the stage, his tall frame commanding attention. Amara stood beside him, clutching his hand tightly as he addressed the crowd. My daughter's story is not unique, Elijah began, his voice carrying over the noise. It is part of a pattern of assumptions, of biases, of judgments made without merit. This isn't just about one flight or one company. It's about a culture that tells people where they belong and where they don't. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the city. Amara looked up at her father, pride shining in her eyes. And let me be clear, Elijah continued, his voice rising, we will not stop until there is accountability. Until there is justice not just for my daughter, but for everyone who has ever been made to feel invisible. As he stepped down from the stage, reporters swarmed him, their questions coming fast and sharp. Amara stayed close, her small hand gripping his, as Evelyn helped shield her from the chaos. But amidst the noise, Elijah felt a sense of purpose stronger than ever. Inside the boardroom, the sound of the crowd was deafening. Ethan stood at the window, watching the scene unfold with a mix of anger and fear. The protests had grown beyond anything he could control, and the pressure from within the company was mounting. One of the board members approached him, her expression steely. This has gone far enough. Ethan, if we don't take action, the fallout will be catastrophic. Ethan turned to her, his face hard. What do you suggest? That we grovel? That we let them dictate how we run this company? She didn't flinch. I suggest we face the truth. Because if we don't, this company won't survive the storm. Ethan said nothing, his jaw tight as the weight of her words settled over him. For the first time, he felt the cracks in his carefully constructed facade begin to widen. That evening, as the protests continued, Elijah received an unexpected call. The voice on the other end was calm, almost too calm. This is Sarah Caldwell, she said. We need to talk. Elijah's grip tightened on the phone. And why should I listen to anything you have to say? Because I want to make it right, Sarah replied. I can't undo what I did, but I can help you understand why it happened. And I think you need to hear it. Elijah hesitated, the anger in his chest warring with his curiosity. Finally, he spoke. Fine, but this conversation doesn't absolve you. Not in the slightest. I understand, Sarah said quietly. I'll see you tomorrow. The air was heavy with anticipation as Elijah Ellison sat in the quiet cafe, a steaming cup of coffee untouched before him. Across the table sat Sarah Caldwell, her hands clasped tightly around a ceramic mug, her expression carefully guarded. Outside, the city pulsed with activity sirens wailing in the distance, the hum of life continuing despite the turmoil brewing beneath its surface. Elijah studied her, his gaze sharp and unyielding. This was the woman who had humiliated his daughter, who had made her feel less than human. Yet, here she was, asking for a chance to explain herself. He wasn't sure if he was here to listen or to confront. But either way, he was ready. Sarah cleared her throat, breaking the tense silence. Thank you for meeting me, she began, her voice steady but tinged with unease. I know I'm probably the last person you want to talk to. You're not wrong, Elijah replied, his tone clipped. So, why don't you get to the point? Sarah nodded, her hands tightening around her mug. I made a mistake, she said, a terrible one, but it wasn't just a mistake, it was a reflection of something I've ignored for too long. The biases, the assumptions I carry, they're not excuses. But they're the truth. Elijah's jaw tightened. And you think admitting that changes what you did? It doesn't erase the harm you caused. I know that, Sarah said quickly, but I need you to understand it wasn't just me. The culture at the airline, the unspoken rules about who deserves what, it's ingrained. People like Ethan Remington perpetuate it. And people like me follow because we're too afraid to push back. Elijah leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. So, you're saying you were just following orders? That sounds awfully convenient. No, Sarah said, her voice firming. I'm saying I let myself believe that following orders was enough. That it absolved me of responsibility. But it doesn't, and it shouldn't. The weight of her words hung in the air. And for a moment, Elijah was silent. He hated her for what she had done. But he also recognized the cracks in her facade, the vulnerability she was exposing. However, reluctantly. What do you want from me? He asked finally. Sarah looked down at her hands. Her voice softer now. I want to help, she said. I want to expose what's happening inside the company. The pressure from Ethan, the way complaints are buried, the way people like me are trained to prioritize certain passengers over others. I want to be part of the change. Elijah stared at her, his thoughts racing. He didn't trust her, not fully, but if what she was saying was true, it could be the key to dismantling the very system that had harmed his daughter. Later that evening, Elijah sat in his study, recounting the conversation to Evelyn. She listened intently, her expression unreadable. Do you believe her? She asked finally. I don't know, Elijah admitted, but if there's even a chance she's telling the truth, we have to use it. The more we expose, the harder it'll be for them to hide. Evelyn nodded slowly. But we need to be careful. If she's lying or if this backfires, it could undermine everything we've worked for. Elijah sighed, running a hand over his face. I know, but this fight isn't just about us anymore. It's about every person who's ever been told they don't belong. We can't let fear stop us. The next morning, Elijah and Sarah met with David Grant, the reporter who had been covering the story from the beginning. Sarah laid everything on the table: emails from Ethan pressuring staff, internal memos that minimized passenger complaints, and first-hand accounts of discriminatory practices. David's eyes widened as he flipped through the documents, his pen moving furiously across his notebook. This is explosive, he said, but it's also dangerous. If we publish this, the airline will come after you. Both of you. Elijah met Sarah's gaze. I'm not afraid of them, he said simply. The truth is more important than their threats. Sarah hesitated, her fear evident, but after a moment, she nodded. Neither am I. The fallout from the exposé was immediate and intense. The article went viral within hours, sparking outrage across the country. The airline's executives scrambled to control the damage, issuing yet another statement that did little to quell the growing anger. Protests outside the headquarters swelled, the chants growing louder and more urgent. Elijah stood among the crowd, Amara by his side, as people held signs that read, "Truth Matters," and "No Justice. No Flight." But the fight wasn't without its costs. Sarah received anonymous threats. Her name and image splashed across tabloids with headlines branding her a traitor. Elijah and his family faced increased scrutiny, their every move dissected by both supporters and detractors. Amara, despite her young age, remained a beacon of strength. She attended the protests with her parents, her presence a reminder of what was at stake. One evening, as they prepared for bed, she looked up at Elijah and asked, "Do you think they'll ever see me for who I really am?" Elijah knelt beside her, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "They will, sweetheart," he said, "because we won't stop until they do." Inside the boardroom, Ethan Remington's empire was crumbling. The evidence against him was mounting, and the board was growing restless. For the first time, his authority was being questioned openly. "We can't keep defending this," one board member said. "The public won't stand for it. And neither will our shareholders." Ethan slammed his fist on the table, his composure cracking. "You're all spineless," he growled. "This company was built on discipline, on order. If we cave now, we lose everything." But his words fell on deaf ears. The tide was turning, and even his allies were beginning to distance themselves. The courthouse steps were bathed in sunlight, but the air was cold with tension. Elijah Ellison stood before a sea of cameras and reporters, his voice steady as he delivered his statement. Behind him, Evelyn and Amara stood side by side, their presence a quiet testament to the stakes of this fight. "This is not just about an airline," Elijah declared, his words deliberate, cutting. "It's about the invisible lines that divide us, the assumptions, the biases, the quiet denials of dignity. These lines have been drawn for too long, and they have cost too much. Today, we draw a new line, a line of accountability, of justice." The crowd erupted into cheers. their voices rising above the faint hum of passing traffic. But amidst the support, there was an undercurrent of unease. The airline's legal team had filed an injunction, attempting to silence the whistleblowers and suppress the evidence that had brought their practices to light. It was a desperate move, but it carried weight. The outcome of this fight would set a precedent, not just for the company but for the nation. Inside the courthouse, the tension was palpable. Elijah sat with his legal team, his hands folded tightly on the table before him. Across the room, the airline's lawyers whispered among themselves, their polished suits and practiced smiles a thin veneer over their clear discomfort. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The proceedings began with a volley of arguments, technicalities, procedural objections, attempts to frame the whistleblowers as disgruntled employees with axes to grind. But Elijah's team was prepared. They presented evidence with precision: internal emails, suppressed complaints, patterns of bias that were impossible to ignore. Vanessa took the stand, her voice trembling at first but growing stronger as she recounted the pressures she had faced. The unspoken rules that governed her every decision. We were told to prioritize certain passengers, she said. It wasn't written down, but we all knew what it meant. People like Amara, people who didn't fit the image they wanted to project, they were treated differently. Her words landed like a hammer, the weight of her testimony reverberating through the courtroom. Outside, the protests swelled. Supporters from across the country had gathered, their signs and chants a visible, audible force. But with the growing crowd came growing tension. Counter-protesters had arrived, their messages of denial and deflection clashing against the calls for justice. Evelyn stood at the edge of the crowd, her eyes scanning the scene. She had always been protective of Amara. But today, the weight of that responsibility felt heavier than ever. Amara stood beside her, holding a sign that read, "I belong." "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Evelyn asked, crouching to meet her daughter's gaze. Amara nodded, her expression resolute. "I'm not scared, Mommy," she said. "I want to be here." Evelyn smiled, her chest tightening with pride. "You're braver than I'll ever be." As the day wore on, the courthouse became a flashpoint. News of the proceedings inside mixed with the energy of the crowd outside, creating a volatile atmosphere. When the airline's lawyers emerged during a recess, they were met with a chorus of boos. But their carefully composed faces betrayed little, their confidence unshaken, or so it seemed. Elijah stepped outside briefly to address the crowd. His voice carried over the noise, calm but firm. "This fight is not just mine. It's ours. Every voice raised here today is a step toward a better future. And I thank you for standing with us." The cheers were deafening, but Elijah knew the day was far from over. Back inside, the proceedings took a darker turn. The airline's legal team introduced character attacks against Vanessa and the other whistleblowers, painting them as opportunists seeking attention. But Elijah's lawyers countered with evidence of the airline's retaliatory tactics, shifting the focus back to the systemic issues at the heart of the case. As the back and forth escalated, Elijah felt the weight of the fight pressing down on him. He glanced at Vanessa, who sat nearby, her face pale but determined. He thought of Amara, waiting outside with Evelyn, her young shoulders carrying a burden far beyond her years. This wasn't just a legal battle, it was a battle for the soul of a nation. The turning point came late in the afternoon when Elijah himself took the stand. The room fell silent as he spoke, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "My daughter is 10 years old," he began. "She's bright, curious, full of life. But on that flight, she was made to feel small, invisible, not because of anything she did, but because of how she was seen, how people like her are too often seen." He paused, his gaze sweeping the courtroom. "This isn't just about Amara. It's about every person who's been told, in ways big and small, that they don't belong. It's about a system that perpetuates those messages, that teaches us to accept them as normal. But they're not normal, and they're not acceptable." His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Even the airline's lawyers seemed momentarily shaken, their polished facades slipping ever so slightly. The day ended with the judge announcing that a decision on the injunction would be delivered the following week. As Elijah left the courthouse, the crowd erupted into cheers, their energy a buoyant force that carried him forward. Amara ran to meet him, her small arms wrapping tightly around his waist. "You were amazing, Daddy," she said, her voice muffled against his coat. Elijah smiled, his hand resting gently on her head. "It's not over yet, sweetheart," he said, "but we're getting closer." The courthouse was hushed, the weight of anticipation pressing down on everyone inside. The judge's decision on the airline's injunction had become a national spectacle. A flashpoint in a battle that had reached beyond a single family's fight for justice. The courtroom was packed with reporters, legal teams, and supporters, all waiting for the ruling that would determine the next chapter of this war. Elijah Ellison sat at the plaintiff's table, his shoulders squared but his hands gripping the edge of the table. Beside him, Vanessa sat with a calm facade that didn't quite hide the tremor in her hands. Evelyn and Amara were in the gallery, Amara's small hand wrapped around her mother's as they both stared intently at the judge. "This court," the judge began, her voice measured but resolute, "finds that the evidence presented by the plaintiffs demonstrates a substantial and credible claim of systemic misconduct within the defendant's organization. The injunction to suppress this evidence is denied." The courtroom erupted, the air charged with a mix of triumph and tension. Elijah exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his gaze flicking back to Amara, who smiled at him with a pride that nearly broke his composure. The ruling ignited a firestorm. News outlets carried the story in bold headlines. "Justice denied no longer. The fight against corporate bias," and "The Ellison case, a reckoning for change." Social media buzzed with messages of support. But the vitriol from detractors also grew louder, sharper, more dangerous. Threats began pouring in not just to Elijah, but to Vanessa and the other whistleblowers. Their bravery had drawn admiration and hatred in equal measure. Elijah's phone rang constantly, his email flooded with messages both uplifting and venomous. He'd expected this, but the sheer magnitude was staggering. Evelyn approached him one evening as he sat in the kitchen, his head in his hands. "You need to take a break," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "This fight isn't going to end tomorrow. You have to pace yourself." Elijah looked up at her, exhaustion etched into his face. "I can't stop, Evelyn, not now." "You're not stopping," she replied. "You're protecting yourself so you can keep going." Her words hit home. He nodded, squeezing her hand. "You're right, I don't want to let her down." "You won't," Evelyn said. "You never have." The airline's response was swift and calculated. Ethan Remington took to the airwaves, delivering a polished statement that framed the company as a victim of misinformation and disgruntled employees. He denied any systemic issues, pointing to the company's diversity initiatives as evidence of their commitment to equity. The statement was met with skepticism, but it rallied the airline's defenders. Counter-protests began cropping up, their signs and chants directly opposing those of Elijah's supporters. The battle lines were drawn, and the nation watched as the conflict grew fiercer. Amara felt the weight of it all more acutely than anyone realized. At school, she was no longer just a student, she was the girl from the news. Some of her classmates rallied around her, but others avoided her, their parents' whispered opinions filtering down into the classroom. One afternoon, as she sat alone at lunch, a boy approached her. "Why don't you just drop it?" he said, his tone both curious and accusatory. "My dad says you're just making trouble." Amara's cheeks flushed, but she held her ground. "It's not trouble to tell the truth," she said, her voice steady, "and your dad doesn't know what it's like." The boy frowned but said nothing more. Amara watched him walk away, her chest tightening with a mix of anger and sadness. She wanted to believe her father's words, that they were making a difference. But some days, it was hard to hold on to that hope. Elijah's next step was a public town hall, an event meant to bring together supporters and skeptics alike. It was a risky move, but he knew it was necessary. If they were going to change minds, they needed to face the opposition head-on. The auditorium was packed, the air buzzing with tension. Elijah stood at the podium, his voice calm but charged with conviction. "This isn't just my fight," he said, his gaze sweeping the room. "It's all of ours. Because this isn't just about an airline, it's about who we are as a society. Do we want to live in a world where people are judged by their worth rather than their worthiness? Where belonging is a privilege rather than a right?" The applause was immediate, but it was met with scattered boos and jeers. One man stood up, his face red with anger. "You're just playing the victim," he shouted. "Looking for a handout." Elijah paused, meeting the man's gaze. "I'm not playing anything," he said, his voice steady. "And I'm not looking for a handout. I'm looking for fairness for a world where my daughter doesn't have to prove she belongs every time she walks into a room." The man hesitated, his anger faltering in the face of Elijah's calm resolve. The room grew quiet, and Elijah continued, his voice rising. "We've been told these problems aren't real, that they're exaggerated or imagined. But the truth is, they're woven into the fabric of our lives. It's time to unravel them. Together." The town hall marked a turning point. More voices began joining the conversation, voices from communities long silenced. Voices that echoed Elijah's message of justice and inclusion. The protests grew larger, more organized, their demands impossible to ignore. But with the momentum came danger. One night, as Elijah and his family prepared for bed, a brick shattered their living room window. A note attached that read, "Stop, or you'll regret it." Evelyn clutched Amara tightly, her face pale but determined. "We're not stopping," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "No matter what." Elijah nodded, his jaw tight. He called the police, but he knew the fight was far from over. The threats weren't just against him, they were against everything he stood for. But if the opposition thought they could scare him into silence, they were wrong. The morning after the brick shattered Elijah's window, the air in his home was thick with tension. The glass had been cleared, but the gaping hole in the frame served as a reminder that the battle they were waging wasn't just about policies or principles, it was personal now. Evelyn moved with quiet efficiency, tidying the living room while keeping one eye on Amara, who sat curled up on the couch with her journal. "We can't let this scare us into silence," Evelyn said, her voice firm. "That's what they want." Elijah nodded, his jaw tight. "But we also can't ignore the risk. We need to be smart about this." Amara looked up from her journal, her young face shadowed with worry. "What if they come back?" she asked, her voice small. Elijah crouched beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "They won't," he said, "and even if they try, we'll be ready. We're not alone in this. Amara, there are so many people standing with us." Amara nodded, her fingers tracing the edges of her journal. "I want to keep fighting," she said softly, "even if it's scary." Evelyn knelt beside her, pulling her into a hug. "You're so brave, sweetheart," she whispered, "braver than most adults." That afternoon, Elijah met with Vanessa and the legal team to prepare for the next round of hearings. The courtroom victory had been significant, but it was only one step in a much larger fight. The airline's leadership was doubling down, their strategy shifting from denial to aggression. They were painting Elijah and the whistleblowers as radicals, intent on destroying a company that had done nothing wrong. "They're trying to discredit us," Vanessa said, her voice tinged with frustration. "They're using the media to turn this around." Elijah leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "Then we need to stay ahead of them. The truth is on our side, but we can't let them control the narrative." David Grant, the journalist who had been covering the story, joined them via video call. "Public opinion is shifting in your favor," he said, "but it's fragile. If they find a way to poke holes in your story or worse, if they succeed in intimidating the whistleblowers, it could all fall apart." Elijah's jaw tightened. "They won't succeed," he said, "because we won't let them." As the protests continued to grow, Elijah decided to address the public directly. He organized a live-streamed event, inviting activists, whistleblowers, and supporters to share their stories. The setting was a small community center, the stage modest but illuminated by the passion of those who spoke. Vanessa took the microphone first, her voice trembling slightly as she began. "For years, I stayed quiet," she said. "I told myself it wasn't my place to speak up, that it wouldn't change anything. But seeing what happened to Amara, seeing her courage, made me realize that staying silent was part of the problem." The audience erupted into applause, their support bolstering her confidence. She continued, recounting the unspoken rules that had governed her workplace, the biases she had witnessed and, at times, perpetuated. Her vulnerability was raw, unfiltered, and it resonated deeply. Next, Elijah stepped forward, his presence commanding. He spoke not just of Amara's experience, but of the broader fight for dignity and inclusion. "This isn't just about one child, one flight, or one company," he said. "It's about a system that tells us who belongs and who doesn't. And it's about our refusal to accept that system any longer." Meanwhile, inside the airline's boardroom, the atmosphere was dire. Ethan Remington's confidence was unraveling as the pressure mounted. The board members were divided. Their once unified front now fractured by the weight of public scrutiny. "This can't go on," one board member said, her tone sharp. "The longer we fight this, the more damage we do to our reputation, to our bottom line." Ethan slammed his hand on the table. "We don't back down," he growled. "If we cave now, we set a precedent. Every disgruntled employee, every unhappy passenger, they'll think they can bring us to our knees." "But what if they're right?" another board member countered. "What if we're the ones who need to change?" Ethan's face darkened, his grip on control slipping further. He knew the tide was turning, but he wasn't ready to concede. Not yet. That evening, Elijah and Evelyn sat together on the couch, their hands entwined as they watched the replay of the live-streamed event. Amara was asleep upstairs, her journal tucked under her pillow. "You're making a difference," Evelyn said softly, her voice filled with pride. "We are," Elijah corrected, his gaze fixed on the screen. "I couldn't do this without you." But even as he spoke, he felt the weight of the fight pressing down on him. The threats, the uncertainty, the relentless pace, it was taking its toll. Yet, he knew they couldn't stop. Not when they were so close to something real. Something lasting. The day of the final hearing dawned gray and heavy, as if the sky itself reflected the tension gripping the city. Elijah Ellison stood in his kitchen, staring at the steaming cup of coffee in his hands. His suit hung crisply on his shoulders, but his face bore the exhaustion of countless sleepless nights. Evelyn entered the room, her presence steady and grounding as she placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "You've done everything you can," she said softly. "Today is about letting the truth speak for itself." Elijah nodded, his jaw tight. "The truth is powerful," he said, "but so is fear, and they've been using fear for a long time." Upstairs, Amara was getting ready. She wore a dress Evelyn had picked out. Simple but elegant, her hair styled with care. In her hands, she clutched her journal, now filled with months of drawings and writings chronicling her journey. Today, she would be in the courtroom, a symbol of why this fight mattered. The courtroom was packed. The air buzzed with anticipation. The benches filled with reporters, supporters, and skeptics. The airline's legal team sat stiffly at their table, their faces unreadable. Across the room, Elijah sat flanked by Vanessa and his attorneys. Amara and Evelyn seated just behind him. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. The proceedings began with final arguments, each side laying out their case. The airline's team argued that the plaintiffs were misinterpreting policies, that the incidents were isolated and exaggerated. But their words rang hollow in the face of the evidence. Elijah's team countered with precision. Vanessa's testimony was followed by statements from other whistleblowers, their voices unwavering as they exposed the company's long-standing biases. Finally, Elijah took the stand, his presence commanding as he recounted Amara's experience and the broader implications of the case. "My daughter's story," he said, his voice clear and resonant, "is not an anomaly. It's a reflection of a deeper truth, a truth we've been taught to ignore because it's uncomfortable. But discomfort is no excuse for inaction." His words landed with weight, the room hanging on every syllable. Even the airline's lawyers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Supporters held signs reading, "Justice for Amara," and "End the silence," their chants echoing through the streets. Counter-protesters stood nearby, their slogans starkly opposing the calls for change. The tension was palpable, the divide a microcosm of the larger conflict gripping the nation. Evelyn stood with Amara at the edge of the crowd, watching as reporters interviewed protesters on both sides. Amara clutched her journal tightly, her young face a mix of resolve and vulnerability. "Do you think they'll listen, Mommy?" she asked softly. Evelyn knelt beside her, brushing a stray curl from her face. "I think they already are," she said, "but listening is only the first step. What matters is what they do next." The judge called for a recess, giving everyone a chance to regroup before the final ruling. Elijah stepped outside, the cold air biting against his skin as he joined the crowd. The chants grew louder at his presence, a swell of support that bolstered him even as the weight of the moment threatened to overwhelm. A reporter approached, microphone in hand. "Mr. Ellison, what do you hope to achieve today?" Elijah met her gaze, his expression steady. "What I hope for is justice," he said, "not just for my daughter, but for everyone who's ever been made to feel invisible. What I demand is accountability, because without it, change is just a word." When the court reconvened, The room was electric with anticipation. The judge began her ruling. Her voice calm but firm. She acknowledged the complexity of the case, the weight of the evidence, and the broader implications of her decision. In this court's view, she said, the plaintiffs have demonstrated that the defendants' practices were not only discriminatory but reflective of a systemic failure to uphold the principles of fairness and equality. This failure has caused harm, not only to the plaintiffs but to countless others who may never have had the opportunity to speak. Elijah's heart pounded as she continued, her words dismantling the airline's defenses piece by piece. Finally, she concluded, this court orders the defendant to implement comprehensive reforms, including mandatory anti-bias training, an independent oversight committee, and restitution to the plaintiffs. Let this serve as a reminder that no institution is above accountability. The room erupted. Supporters cheered, their voices rising in triumph, while the airline's lawyers sat stone-faced, their defeat undeniable. Elijah turned to Amara, who smiled at him through tears, her pride shining brighter than the courtroom lights. We did it, she whispered. No, Elijah said, his voice thick with emotion. You did it. In the days that followed, the impact of the ruling rippled across the country. News outlets covered the story extensively, framing it as a landmark victory in the fight against systemic bias. Other industries began examining their own practices, spurred by the courage of those who had spoken out. The airline's leadership underwent a dramatic shake-up. Ethan Remington resigned under pressure, his departure marking a symbolic end to an era of complacency. Vanessa and the other whistleblowers were hailed as heroes, their bravery inspiring others to come forward. One evening, Elijah and Evelyn stood on the balcony of their home, watching as the city lights twinkled in the distance. Amara was inside, sketching in her journal with a contentment they hadn't seen in months. We've come so far, Evelyn said, her voice filled with quiet wonder. But there's still so much to do. Elijah nodded. Change doesn't happen overnight, he said, but we've lit a fire. And now it's up to us and everyone else to keep it burning.